Hello, everyone, and welcome to Google Campus in London, where I am joined by Preston Byrne of Eris Industries.
Hey,
How you
Evan.
doing, man?
I'm really well. How are you?
Yeah, very, very well. Good to have you with us.
Great.
And also from Frankfurt, Germany, we have Theo Goodman.
Hello, everybody.
And from California, we have Thomas Hunt.
Good morning, Bitcoins.
Love it. Okay, well, thanks for being with us. We did promise you this show last week when I was at the Eris launch down in Rainmaking Loft. Is it Rainmaker's Loft? Rainmaking
I think
Loft?
it's rainmaking.
Rainmaking Loft. So they make rain there.
Apparently so.
This is apparently like an old con trick that you used to do where you used to promise someone you could make rain, and then like if it didn't rain, you'd go, well, it's because you didn't pay me enough to make it rain, and then you turn up the next day and hopefully it was raining, and you say, see, I made it rain.
They refer to partners at law firms who bring in business as rainmakers, sort of in the sort of Indian shaman kind of sense.
Right.
So I think that's what it was going for. It's like, come to our loft and you will make many money, very currency. Wow. so we figured that was a good place to start.
Very cool. And what was the reception like afterwards? We stood around for a long time drinking afterwards. That's what I remember.
Yeah, 2 or 3 hours. I mean, it was good. We had a good mix of people. A couple of guys from the banking sector were there. A couple of VCs. Most importantly, the Ethereum guys showed up. Quite a few of them. Vinay and George Hallam. A lot of the London crypto set, Richard Bowes, Paul Ferris, Paul Gordon, they all showed up, which was great. The Adam Smith Institute and some think tanky people were there. City AM was there. I mean, we didn't do a big press release or anything like that. We did not do a press release at all. But basically, we said, let's just invite people who we know, who are interested in this stuff, and who we can follow up with afterwards, who would actually, be interested in learning more about it. So that was our objective. So yeah.
Well, one of the reasons why we wanted to do the show later was because it wasn't really the right setting to be asking you technical questions about your product, and so we wanted to explore that more. But I'd like, if I may, to start with the team that you've chosen. This is your website. The link is in the description below, erisindustries.com. Could you just take us through some of these people and why you enjoy working with them so much?
Sure. Well, I guess we'll start on the right and then work our way up the chain, so to speak. So on the right we have Jan Roncher and David Galbraith. And one of the reasons we can give away what we're doing is because we have VC funding, and we think that's actually a pretty good thing because it means you can focus on developing software rather than trying to sell stuff to the community, which gives us a lot of flexibility. So David Galbraith, he is a former founder of Yelp. He also once, which is why I really like him and I'm glad he's on the team, he was approached by, phone ringing. He was approached by Lockheed Martin for, what do they call it, sort of DNS squatting. And so he said to the law firm in question that sent him the nasty letter, I'll turn it over, no questions asked, but you have to send me a picture of a puppy before I do so. And there's a very funny correspondence on Gawker, and it's like, no, here's a picture of a kitten. Now, all I need is a picture of a puppy, and you will get this domain name. So he's a pretty cool guy. Jan Roncher is known quite widely in the fintech space, particularly in London. So he's a director of the company. He's also I don't know quite what his rank is at Anthemis. I think it's a similar title, which is Anthemis Group, and they are headquartered in Geneva but have a large presence in London. They discovered us sort of last year and helped us really bring this product to the beta phase, and we really couldn't have done it without them. To our left is Blockchain Yoda, otherwise known as Ethan Buckman. So he's quite involved with the Ethereum set, and so he's our expert on blockchains and consensus. Then moving over, we have Andreas Olofsson, who's also going to be known pretty much to anybody in the Ethereum community. He built a dApp, or a distributed application, on Ethereum, which basically replicated a state. So you had a central bank, you had property registries, all the rest of it. And he did that with cryptographic scripts called smart contracts, which live on a blockchain. At the time he did it, he was doing it on Ethereum. Now, obviously, we're doing it on our own blockchain design, which we call Thelonious, after the jazz musician. Immediately to the left is Tyler Jackson, also known as Dennis McKinnon. He is, again, an absolutely crack smart contract drafter, and what he came up with was a kernel that lives in the Genesis block, where we're putting all of the consensus, security, and other permissions parameters. So it's basically where all of the logic of a blockchain is stored. We now put it in the Genesis block instead of having it hard-coded into the chain. The benefit of that is, of course, the key innovation that Ethereum came up with, in our view, was the pairing up of a scripting language with a blockchain, which had not been done before.
Right.
And so, as a consequence, he realized pretty early on that if you have a scripting language and a blockchain that are part of the same system, you can tell that blockchain to do pretty much whatever the hell you want. So as a consequence, he kept working on it, and now our blockchain design is capable of changing its own parameters over time, because you're scripting those permissions, those read and write permissions, into the Genesis Doug. If we name the contract Doug, which we represent through Marmot, the handsome fellow there, we know who that is. And then Casey, our CEO, is a Trade with Dave. Dave from Trade with Dave called him the most interesting man in the world. And Casey is a lawyer. He is a very good software developer. He also is a former U.S. Marine, and there was a piece in the New Yorker magazine. He was there when Saddam Hussein's statue was torn down. But there was nearly a diplomatic incident when a young conscript decided he was going to put the American flag on Saddam Hussein's face. Casey had the presence of mind to get an Iraqi flag, old style, out of his Humvee and bring it over, and which basically prevented a diplomatic incident as a result.
Wow, so that's his claim to fame.
His claim to fame, and he's our CEO, and and very fun to work with, and so that's the team.
So if I could sum this up, then, so you've got legal here, you've got technical here, and then you've got finance here, right?
Sort of finance, more like business advisory.
Right.
None of us have run a software company before, but we know blockchain pretty well. So in a sense, the Anthemis guys, they've been giving us a lot of logistical support, free office space, that kind of stuff. Casey and I'm basically pure legal and commercial. And then Casey bridges the gap between the two. And so the team as a whole is able to create a software platform which is fundamentally different, I think, than anything that's really existed in the blockchain space before. And that's why.
You guys seem to like having your picture taken against brick walls. I have to say, I'm actually a big fan of it as well.
Well, we were.
Tom always tells me don't do it like in such a dull background, but I think it really works.
We were in the distillery district. We went out to Canada for a month and went out in the middle of nowhere for a month to build the damn thing.
Right.
And,
so
yeah.
Right. So I wanted to move very swiftly then on to what the hell is this thing?
Yeah.
Because what you've gone with as a kind of a marketing strategy is you've gone for what we call long form content.
Yeah.
Which is not your vanilla style. It's what we prefer here on the World Crypto Network. So you're in home turf here. But I think from a layperson's point of view, I just wanted to see if I could just explain to you what I think it is, and for you to maybe correct me where I go wrong, just to see if I've understood it correctly. We've already been through it the other day, of course, and people were seeing you, so it's not as if our audience isn't going to have some idea. So essentially, this breaks down into what I see as being three main categories. You've got the D server, which you can install here, and this takes you through the process. And this is kind of like your mining community. It doesn't even, you don't even need miners. You can just mine your own blockchain.
Your D server is your application server. It's Simon de la Rouvière put it this way. He said, much in the same way that Tesla says, we try to make a good car that happens to be electric.
Right.
We tried to make an application server that just happens not to have a server involved.
Yeah.
So what the D server does is it allows a user through a web browser, or rather to develop applications that through an ordinary web browser can talk to a blockchain, and not only talk to a blockchain, but can talk to any blockchain through one client. So if anyone who wants to check out our demo video, which Andreas did a little while ago, you can basically switch back and forth between chains and between applications on different chains, or alternatively, the D server houses modules which enable your application to then talk to other blockchains and other protocols.
Right.
I grant this is less than fully trustless when you're doing it if you haven't.
Sure. But one of the things I wanted to pick out here was then you've also got Thelonious, named after the jazz musician, and this is an open source blockchain design.
Correct.
And this basically means that at the moment we have this plethora of altcoins, and we've been seeing new ones every week, and people were basically going through the dictionary, just putting coin on the end of the words. And what this sounds to me like is that you're thinking of the blockchain as a structure, as a database, rather than as a currency. In fact, I hardly see any mention to currency. There is a little bit of that in the blog, where you say, yes, there is the essence of the currency, but then there's also the way in which you handle the data.
Yeah, we look at a blockchain as a database technology, end of, full stop. MongoDB, Apache, SQL, blockchain. It is a type of database with particular characteristics, which makes it very good at mediating human relations in a peer-to-peer fashion in a secure way. And so if you look at it that way, you understand that an application requires a degree of consensus. If I send you a message on Twitter or Facebook, when I query Twitter servers or Facebook servers and try to get that message up. I want to make sure that you're looking at the same message I sent. A blockchain does that in a rather different way. We're not actually shoving all of that information onto the blockchain, but it's intended to utilize an off-chain architecture, standard DHT, BitTorrent, something like that.
Right, you're using a lot of technical terms.
Yeah.
So essentially what you're saying, Apache is a way of hosting a website.
Right.
MongoDB and SQL are database structures.
Correct.
And then you've got, sorry, what was the last thing you mentioned?
And then you've got off-chain things such as BitTorrent.
BitTorrent, DHT. So distributed hash table is basically a table of cryptographic digests that uniquely refer to the existence of documents.
Correct.
Right, and in such a way that if you change one thing about that document, the whole hash changes. So you have this kind of thing called the avalanche effect, and these are used, these cryptographic digests, which you will have seen before. We often read them out here on this show. They're hexadecimal. They usually are like A9C5, you know, DD. And what they refer to is the actual state of a file, byte by byte. And they're often used in timestamping and checkpointing to say this document existed in this state at this time. If anyone tried to change it, you would know. Yeah. It would alert you. Okay.
But I mean, I think the high-level view about what the blockchain does is exactly the same way in Bitcoin. If we view Bitcoin as an application, and that application is an alternative monetary system which follows certain rules, any other application can be run on a blockchain, and any other application can have its logic dictated by a blockchain. And so the thesis that we have is that with the current way that the internet is structured, application developers, if they want to grow an application in scale, they have to use cloud computing, they have to use servers, and in addition to that, that creates some rather perverse incentives to take their users' data and sell it. So we said, what if you could use an architecture where you would use the distributed internet to provide that same kind of functionality to an application developer? What if Mark Zuckerberg could, enlist his users and their hard drives and their processors in order to run Facebook? And so if that could happen, then you wouldn't need advertising revenue necessarily in order to administer that application. So we figured that was a very important missing piece of the distributed internet. People voluntarily giving up their processors and hard drive space. It's not without precedent, mind you. Skype used to do it. Spotify used to do it. So, and that helped those applications scale.
Microsoft do it now.
Microsoft do it now. So it's something where there's not a particularly effective way of repeating that architecture again and again and again. And we looked at the blockchain and said, if you need to have an agreed state of data, which everyone is accessing all at the same time, which is absolutely necessary if you're going to run a web-style interactive application, then why not use the blockchain in order to hold the logic to that application? Right. So, and this has many applications, both commercial and non-commercial, in the sense that if you look at Bitcoin in this way, the innovation is not necessarily that it's cutting out the financial institution. Why do financial institutions charge us money? Because they have overheads and because they have staff. Yeah. So what Bitcoin is doing is it's carrying out a very particular function, clearing and settlement. Well, not clearing, but settlement. It's sort of merged into one, but it's doing it without any of the overheads of those financial institutions. And so we said, well, what if you had an automatic database without necessarily mining the daylights out of it and making it very difficult to process transactions? But we can get onto that later, how we look at that problem. What if you could distribute a database like this and people would voluntarily participate in the internet? So you'd have a layer of the internet where you get all of that interactivity without necessarily having to surrender control over your data. So that's the principle. We wanted to give people back control over their data. The best way to, and we look at the blockchain as a database which allows application logic to be distributed and followed relatively, highly predictably. And you don't need a currency for that because you're actually giving people something which is really useful. So you don't necessarily need to incentivize.
So let's think of a real world example. So one of the people I've been talking a lot to recently is Isabella Kaminska from the Financial Times. Yeah. And she is a long-term critic of Bitcoin. And her and I have been talking to see if we can find some compatibility between our different philosophies. Now, one of the things that she talked to me about was when the RBS, the Royal Bank of Scotland servers went down recently. They had an IT problem as they spun it. But in actual fact, this is quite a terrifying prospect because the IT guys there have to keep regular backups of the database, of the ledgers. Because in the event that they go down, you are often reliant on the customers being honest and reporting back and saying, well, I had £500 in my account, now it's not there, right? Yeah. Because if your backup is 50 minutes late, 50 minutes, you have a black hole of data because it can't keep the latency on these networks is too low for the kind of durable backup that you often need. They have RAID and so on, but if my understanding was there was some corruption that took place in the database. So they could have been running something like this. That this could have been distributed. You could have had parity built in over space and time so that it had redundancy. Is that correct?
Correct.
And then you would have locked in the sequence of events without having this kind of awkward moment where we might have to kick this one over to the support team and they've just got to use their discretion down the phone when customers call up.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions we keep getting asked is if you're giving this stuff away, because everyone in crypto is, people were asking you on Twitter today, this episode, what are they selling? And we're like, nothing. And people go, well, how are you going to make money? And the answer is that it's a very, very long game. And so you create something and you update it and you keep it really very well maintained and you develop the right tools. And eventually you're going to get banks looking at distributed systems once they've been proven in the field in totally freestanding applications. So blockchain fault tolerance is something which we know the corporates are interested in. It's automatic and sort of built-in security means you can collapse the logic of a lot of existing systems and oversight that's currently needed because you can predict what it's going to do with a given set of inputs and a given set of outputs. There are people in Bitcoin who aren't going to like that. They're going to say, well, the whole point is to get that financial institution out of the equation. But if you were the financial institution or any other corporate or any other organization or an international development agency for that matter, looking to do things like financial inclusion, this is actually a very effective way of getting a very resilient, low-cost database out into the field. And then in addition to that, you can update it on command. So you're not updating your hardware, you're just updating the logic. So, so this is, from our perspective, the next step. Just as Bitcoin runs without fixed infrastructure, there are ways of structuring a blockchain so that it runs with very little cost and very little fixed infrastructure. And we think that would be profoundly useful in commercial and non-commercial applications. It will change, in our view, the structure of the internet, as it has changed several times before. ARPANET. ARPANET is no longer there. It is outdated because there are more efficient ways of dealing with that data. And we looked at blockchains and said, for now, as part of this distributed system, the blockchain is the best solution that we know of. If there is a better one, maybe it's Betamax of the distributed computing world. Maybe we'll one day just be able to move all of the consensus mechanisms into a VM. Those are all things we're considering, but for the time being, the blockchain component is a very important part of it. And it should be something, I think, which is relevant to people in Bitcoin and everywhere else, because all the things that you like about Bitcoin, you can now get with a reduced trust rather than fully trustless, although I think that's a misnomer, but it's a reduced trust layer. What are we looking at?
No, I'm just, you carry on. I'm just setting up some links.
It's a reduced trust layer where you know that the person deploying that application doesn't even have, from the very beginning, they don't have incentives to mess with your data. And if they were messing with your data, you'd be able to tell that they were because you could understand what the logic is.
Exactly. And one of the cool things is that it's still compatible with Bitcoin. But what strikes me as interesting is that Ethereum spend a lot of bandwidth and a lot of their thinking capacity working out the mining problem. They've spent an awful lot of time looking at distributed proof of stake, and it sounds to me like you've just completely just said that's a non sequitur. If you create this server, let's take a look at since we're getting quite technical, and if there are any developers watching, I think it would be good just to show them the tutorial. Then they can get started right here and now.
Yeah, so we actually have a video up on our YouTube channel as well of the D server. But in effect, all we have at the moment is the admin screen where you can specify what data you want to go onto a particular blockchain. And you can use EPM and things like that. I don't want to go into that. Casey, I think, might be better to handle that.
Yeah.
But in effect, that's a web browser which allows you to load, display, run, and interact with the dApp. Because you're too smashed to talk, does someone just actually say that? So basically, oh gosh, where were we? That was pretty amusing. So where were we?
so you're saying that the people can install the D server, because I think that what I'm trying to get to, the way this comes across to me, is very, very clever, but the way that you guys have presented it so far is it's very, very dense, and I'm in the business of helping people understand complex things. So I'm trying to say this is essentially a way for you to bootstrap your own blockchain sans currency, or with or without currency.
So what you would do is you would take your D server, you would boot your D server, you would find a chain, or you would start a chain, you'd load the chain. After you've loaded the chain, you would deploy contracts onto the chain. After deploying contracts onto the chain, you would run it, and copy that. if you were joining a new chain, you would download the contracts, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. You're downloading the contractual architecture, but you're not, that doesn't mean you're able to interact with the chain if you say, well, haha, I'm going to download a sneaky contract. No. You're downloading the suite of contracts, which is going to match up to what you were doing on that chain, and then you're putting it into the VM. So in effect, the D server is it translates what you see into blockchainese, in that it allows you to interact with it and any other chain that a module is written for. So that's its role, to translate between the user and the underlying logic of the application, and to link up that application into other APIs and other pieces of software. So that's what it does. It sits, if you imagine Thelonious at the bottom, and then you have the server sitting at the top talking to the rest of the world.
So let me give you another example, because this is something I proposed a while ago on Reddit. Like, as a journalist, what I'd really like, in fact, what I'm already doing on my computer is I'm timestamping pretty much every professional interaction that I have. So I put a Git repo inside of my Evernote folder. Evernote is like a database. You've got it on your mobile. You can take pictures of things. It reads the text for you. You can download web pages into it. You're reading with highlights and annotations. Now, as a journalist, when I'm researching things, I'm notarizing all of my research, all of my interviews, and I'm timestamping it all in near real time, like every 24 hours or so, in such a way that if someone wants to scrutinize me later, I can just show them my hash table, and I'm putting the Merkle roots into the blockchain. Is this your tool something that's more elegant than the way I've been doing it? Because I've just been hacking it with currently tools, but I could do something similar, could I?
You could, but I mean, the trust profile would be different. So if you're dealing with a blockchain which is under someone's control, so let's say we start up Chris record chain, and you run Chris record chain, you do have a piece of evidence, and let's say someone said, well, actually, I think you were in Japan and you committed a murder that weekend.
Right. Yes.
And so you could fall back on the chain and say, well, hold on a second, I timestamped it here and then. Yes, there is a possibility under those circumstances that if the Japanese courts decided they wanted to come after you, they'd look at it and say, well, no, you weren't actually there. So it might have been more useful to find some more rock solid way of verifying your whereabouts and what you were doing at the time. However, it still is evidence. And so this system relies on the fact that that TTP, as Nick Szabo calls it, interpolation, is not necessarily such a bad thing. And in fact, in many circumstances, it's a very good thing, because it makes transactions more efficacious, or it makes applications run better. Trusted third party.
Oh, okay.
So in the sense, we with Thelonious, you can parameterize it to do whatever you want. So if whatever mining algo you come up with, do it, deploy it. Our standard, the default is actually standard SHA-3 proof of work. So it's not, this is not such a radical departure. If you want to create a cryptocurrency and mine it and have token rewards for doing it, you can do so. However, this is really about allowing people to explore other consensus mechanisms to deploy, test, iterate again and again and again without having to rely on a central chain or spend any amount of money to do so. So you can try different things. The other extreme that we have is the lockdown chain, where simply only certain nodes are allowed to sign blocks, and a block won't get added to the end of the chain unless it's been so signed. So
okay, that's interesting.
So for certain deployments, I think if you were a bank or a government, it is more likely that if you were using a blockchain database, you would go for the very, very closed one. If you're doing some kind of social network or something else, you're going to want to have, well, to a certain extent, a lower threshold of security, because what's someone going to double spend? A cat picture? I mean, that's. But at the same time, you could parameterize additional control, and then if any of the nodes misbehaves, now because you can amend the logic of the chain, you just kick them off.
Right.
So this is it allows for a very flexible way of looking at how a distributed database.
And of course, to take it back to my example, I could of course just be checkpointing my hashes in the Bitcoin blockchain, even using your service. So even if you didn't want to trust the algo on mine, I could still be checkpointing on the blockchain.
Correct.
Now, finally, just before we break out, so I know that Theo will have some questions, and maybe Tom too. What is the business model? How are you going to monetize this? Because I didn't see any whiff of a crowd sale. I was like, this is the most honest proposal we've ever had in the Bitcoin space. Like, the guy's not asking for money. Are they insane? Do they not know how this thing works? So you're not asking for money. So where is the money coming from?
For the next couple of years, probably nowhere. We think that blockchains are really useful. There are those who would disagree and say that blockchains are really only useful in cryptocurrency applications. They hold their view, we hold ours, and good luck to them, and hopefully good luck to us. But from our perspective, we want to see what these things can do in other applications. In order to get to the point where you're how to describe it. A crypto issuing a coin, we've mentioned Eris coin, we jokingly said, if you issue a coin, that gets you, it gets you some funding, it gets you somewhere, but it doesn't get you very far. This is a software business. It is designed to make tools, deploy them, and see what happens when people actually use them. From our perspective, we'll probably provide support and services to large enterprises or other large organizations. But that, in order to get there, the model is the Red Hat model. You need to make it free.
Right.
You need to make it free for everyone.
Right.
So from our perspective, that's what you do first, and then later down the line, no bank, no corporate or organization of any consequence, as things stand today, is going to let you walk in and start fiddling with their stack. No way. Not going to happen. So you need to battle test these things. All of this technology is experimental. Very few, I think Fidor Bank in Germany is one of the few banks that actually uses a consensus ledger. They use Ripple as a sort of, what's it called? I can't remember the Arabic word for it now. But basically they use it as a ledger to move large amounts of currency between their various branches. So, but that again, you have a corporate entity behind it administering that ledger.
So so in brief, it's an upsell. You're making money by upselling to larger clients like Red Hat Linux do, where it's free for the general user, but then if you're a big enterprise solution, then if you're a big enterprise, then you've got a solution for them where you can go in and add
the software is free, the services are not.
Right.
So that's the model that we're going for, and we don't think really anyone else is doing it.
No,
so
not in our space.
Yeah, which surprises that one of me actually. We were sitting there going like, has no one really come up with this yet? Has anyone seriously?
So in a way, you're kind of like consultants as well. Like, is that how you see yourself?
We'll see how it goes. I mean, it's very early days. We incorporated the company 6 months ago. We really sort of got moving in earnest in October, September, October, and now we are where we are. So we're going to see where it goes, see how it plays. We have to create a market that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And that's a tough sell. It's a tough proposition, but we think it's worth doing.
Great. Well, look, let's open it up, guys. What do you think, Theo? Talk to us.
I think it's really interesting. I'm just trying to figure out how I can scam it somehow, but I haven't figured out how yet. So basically, I'm just trying to figure out. So the data isn't stored on a server. So where is it stored? So if I make ThioChain, which is kind of like how it's called already. It's already called ThioChain, right? What's the guy? Thelonious, not Theodore. Anyway,
so Thelonious.
What I want to say is, right.
Well,
he's Theo too, but he's a different one.
So Thelonious is your standard garden variety blockchain in the sense that you have a locally stored copy.
Okay.
And if you're running a full node, it's just like any other blockchain. But that's where the data, which is primarily based, it's the logic of the application, and it tells you where to look for things. So and then you use other protocols.
Okay.
BitTorrent or something like that to hold the files. So you're not bloating the blockchain.
Well, I mean, I would just do a whole bunch of experiments, and probably most people would say it's spam or it's bloat or whatever, but that wouldn't be an issue because of the way it's designed. And if somebody was abusing one of the chains, you could just change the rules so that it fixes it. Like you said, if somebody's double spending I love cat photos, then you just change it and kick them off the chain. Is that right? Isn't that what you said, basically?
Effectively, yes. I mean, a blockchain is this, it is the sum of its parts. So if you are looking at time now and you've just added a transaction to time now, which the blockchain in totality says this user no longer has read or write permissions, then that user no longer has read or write permissions. They can attempt to wind back the chain and add on another transaction. But if the longest chain is winning and you're in control of the consensus parameters, then that's not going to do them any good because they're not going to be able to get that transaction onto the shared database across the network.
Okay. So basically, I'm in control of my ThioChain, and I can set the rules. And you have to trust me if you want to do stuff on my chain because I can control the logic. Right.
That's how you set it. I mean, one thing we did with Eris 0.1 is we built in a function where you could have user consensus. So you could set something like in the last 10,000 blocks, and it's scripting, it's programming. You can tell this thing to do whatever the hell you want. If we're going to change the code, we need a 2/3 majority of the users who have sent a transaction in the last 10,000 blocks. And if they decide to append that code to a particular contract, then the logic of the blockchain will change, and not under any other circumstances. So it is entirely possible to do that. It is also possible if you want to revert and then leave some things hard-coded in the chain so that you need to hard fork it if you want to change its parameters. Again, we looked at this and said, blockchains are, could be a very useful developer tool. And rather than saying, we're going to set this set of parameters and developers, you better do what we say, we've turned around and said, well, at the moment, the way that the industry is structured is that you have centralized developer teams. Let's be honest, that's what they are. And those centralized developer teams are the guardians of their particular databases. And we said, that's crazy. If it's a database technology. Any developer should be able to use it for any purpose they wish. Someone's just saying, slow down. Sorry.
Right.
Slow down.
So, okay, yeah. So what I wanted to, what did I want to say? Shit. Yeah, okay, now I lost track with the slow down part. But, so if it's not, you're the custodian of the Thelonious chain, right? I mean, basically, I'm just trying to say, if I...
Thelonious is a design.
Well, okay, sorry. Well, basically, I just want to say, what I want to ask is, if I build a whole bunch of stuff on, using all this, and you guys, it doesn't work out, your company doesn't work out, is all my stuff gone?
No, I mean, I think.
Well, we will need patching. We will.
I mean, in the sense that if we disappear, the technology has been released. I think we use the same. I'm not sure which license it was, but it was the same license Ethereum used for theirs. So genie's out of the bottle. Nothing happens to your chain if we disappear. All that happens is there are support services and dedicated development on that design and on the tools. That are no longer happening, or that some other entity has taken over. But from our perspective, genie's out of the bottle. You can do really whatever you want with it, and there's really very little we can do about it. That's how open source works. So that's what we did, and so it's out.
Great. So do you plan on making some kind of like drag and drop contracts for people that are not really into programming so much?
We have something called the Eris Standard Library, which is just a very basic list of functions. But our perspective is we're working on 2 dApps, distributed applications. There's some dispute. Some people are like, stop calling them dApps, but we're calling them dApps. So we're working on a couple of dApps now. One of them is a streaming video one, as I mentioned earlier. The other one is a marketplace. And we think that by doing by example and saying, this is what the app looks like, this is what it does, this is how the contracts work that sit underneath it, that's really the best way to show people how they want to develop on it, and that's coming in 2 or 3 weeks. So we're going to try to show people as much as we can, how we view the system, because we're cognizant that there are maybe half a dozen people in the world who know what they're doing with a system like this, and all of them would be in Ethereum or Eris Industries. But we're going to try to make it as simple as possible for people to understand how you tell a blockchain to do something in a JavaScript runtime, and hopefully people will catch on.
So part of me feels like this.
So I can do it.
Sounds a bit like a side chain.
No.
Maybe no. It's not a side chain.
Okay.
No.
You could do it. Well, I guess I could do a side chain. Well, I don't need to do a side chain. I can do my own pre-sale on it, right?
Being a lawyer, I can't imagine why you would want to do that. But really, that's the point. This is a blockchain with which a developer can do whatever the hell they damn well please. And there is nothing that we as a development team can say about it. Nothing. Obviously, that's the end of it, and that's it. We see a world where there are millions of blockchains.
You've made it really neutral, and you've just taken it down to its base level.
Yeah.
I really like that.
Well, I'm impressed that someone's finally building a decentralized application like Bitcoin. So many times we see decentralized Bitcoin, and the first thing people want to do is let's build a centralized bank, or let's build a centralized tip bot, or whatever we're going to do. Let's take that decentralization, simplify it, and centralize it. So I think you have the right approach, open sourcing it, making it like Red Hat, where it's a database layer. And one of the things I liked is you talked about if a bank used it, if instead of the Royal Bank of Scotland using their own confusing backed up system which could easily fail, they could use this distributed system, have different bank computers mining their ledger, keep a bunch of copies of it. And like Chris always says with the Merkle root and with the way the tree branches out, that no one could edit the data, that we would see if you edited the data because there'd be a hole there. Isn't that part of the reason for this technology?
That's just the thing. I mean, in commercial relations, so let's say you are a bank, and let's say you are RBS, and you are using a blockchain database for something, and it transpires that you went back in time and you amended that database and did all the recalculations in order to cover up a fraud. Firstly, that's really, really hard to do. I mean, that's not easy. And to query whether a bank would have even a bank would have the technical capacity to do that, go back several years in the chain, and then recompute all the transactions, even if it were one that controlled. One. Two, the commercial consequences of such an act would be so catastrophic that in the event of that kind of a fraud taking place, one, the bank would be insured and would satisfy any liabilities it had incurred that way. And secondly, it would have compliance procedures in place. There are people, many of whom are quite eminent in this space, who I won't name, who have a problem with that. And they say, well, no, you need to have a fully trustless system. Otherwise, you're exposed to this and that and this and that. And we looked at it and said, this actually causes more commercial problems than it solves in rather a lot of applications. Take, for example, your distributed interactive web application. When we log into Facebook or we log into Google Mail or God knows what else, we don't care whether a little widget has been updated or whether something's been improved. We just want to use the service and for it to work. And so in every application that we use in daily life, we do not want to be overly invested in the maintenance and development of that application. We want someone to take care of it for us. So given that the world works like that, that's what we built to. And we said, this is something where an application developer now has the ability to develop and actually build something useful and upgrade it and update it on an ongoing basis. And the user gets a reasonable degree of certainty. But if you chose, for example, to cut mining out of the equation, which is an optionality which you can include, then yes, you do have a trust issue in that someone's administering the database and their disappearance could compromise the data. That is no different from what we're doing today with all of our web applications. But at the same time, the incentives to misbehave with our data are gone. And in addition to that, the ability of governments and other organizations to take these networks down disappears. If you want to take down a blockchain distributed network, you have to do one of two or both of these things. You have to kill everyone who's running a node and make sure the node is destroyed, or you have to shut down the internet. So from our perspective, there are some very substantial personal liberty benefits, particularly in regimes where personal liberty is not valued, where this technology is going to be useful, even with an administrator who is based somewhere else. Getting behind the Great Firewall of a particular East Asian nation would be something which should be useful. So yes, there are compromises everywhere. Blockchains today are not perpetual motion machines. We trust miners, and speaking perfectly frankly, I would rather trust someone I can find when they screw up. So
that's a good point. That's a very good point.
So how let's go over the current state of database technology. Let's say that I was a generic blogging company and you blogged on my website and you had a bunch of posts. I could go in and edit it because I own the database. Anybody that works for me that has access to that database could go in and edit it. Anybody who works for me who steals our password, they find it on a Post-it note, they could then have access. Anyone who has access to the physical office could steal the Post-it note. Delivery man. So this would change, right?
In a sense, I mean, if you had in a sense, depends on how you parameterized it. Let's assume central control is being exercised from one point. So and the network itself is distributed. Your data would be stored on BitTorrent. That would be beyond. So let's say you had a module for end-to-end encryption. The operator of the blockchain wouldn't see it. It would just hold the pointer to the file, right, or rather the hash of the file. Yeah. And then and the access permissions to the particular pointer, which is pointing someone you want towards the hash of that file. So in a sense, it's on BitTorrent. It's no longer in somebody's server. If they amended the database, they wouldn't actually be amending the file. They would be amending the pointer to the file, which meant that other people who were using that database or the blockchain database weren't able to find it. So yeah, they could cut you out conceivably, but you're not looking at the same kind of pervasive control over your data, which we have today, in the sense that access, read, sell, that could be largely removed from this equation. Or to the extent that it couldn't, it would be transparent how it was being done.
Sounds good. Chris, do you want to talk about the name?
Yeah, so we have a question from Ajan in Thailand, and he wants to know, why did you choose the word Eris as the title? What's the thinking behind that?
Well, the full question is Eris, of course, the goddess of discord, strife, and chaos. And the reason we picked that is because Casey said, "Hey, so who's the Greek goddess of discord, strife, and chaos?" So I mean, there are two funny names. There's Doug. Doug is what we affectionately call the smart contract kernel that lives in the Genesis block. And so Doug is really because Alice, Bob, and Carol were already taken, and because Doug was a first-class citizen on the database, we felt the name would be appropriate. And Eris was just Casey going, "So who's the Greek goddess of chaos? This is really going to mess stuff up, isn't it?" And so that's where Eris came from. Yeah. It's completely exactly what you think it is.
All right, because I was curious too, because I've read Principia Discordia, and I'm down with all the Illuminatus trilogy and all the Robert Anton Wilson stuff. There's a lot of Hail Eris going on out there if you search for that. So
it's all there.
So if you have any questions, please text in. I guess we'll still continue talking because I wanted to bring up one of my favorite authors at the moment I'm reading on the Kindle. This is Robert Harrison. He's got a great podcast and radio show called KZSU at Stanford University called Entitled Opinions. And I've been reading a lot of his work recently. And one of the things that he brings up in his book, Forests, the Shadow of Civilization, is he brings up Euripides and the Bacchae. And I wanted to, because, you know, every time we had it, if you've been following us on the World Crypto Net, you know that Preston and I often do have these kind of very, these philosophical discussions about law, because law is one of the first things to emerge in any civilizations, the rules of how should we conduct ourselves. And I've always said that the best laws are the ones that everyone understands, the majority of people, if not everyone, plays by. Because the problem that Socrates and Plato's Socrates brings up in the Republic, our favorite discussion topic, is he says, look, if the people, if the demos see, or the hoi polloi, they will say, the hoi polloi see the king not playing by the rules, then they've got no incentive to play by the rules. And so and now we're looking at the banks and we're looking at the bailouts and we're thinking, hang on, it's one set of rules for them, it's another set of rules for us, and it can breed a certain amount of chaos, and you end up getting the tyranny of the majority. You end up getting the mob. And which is the worst kind of all, because you can't behead every head. At least with an aristocrat monarch, mono architecture, you get one head. Now, one of the interesting things that Harrison points out is the Bacchae, which is a play by Euripides that he wrote towards the end of his life. And he talks about, I'll just quote here, so this is in the city of Thebes, okay? The Dionysus, the god of wine and the earth, comes to somebody, right? He says, so one day a god appears, no one knows from where, but from afar, and the city loses its mind. Piety, laws, and the civic order break down before his epiphany. Thrown into a state of agitation by the presence of the god, the women rush from their homes and make their way in swarms to the mountains, out of their houses, out of their city, out of their minds, they go into the forests. And so one of the things that Harrison explores here is who we become when the lights go out. How do we make our turn, and how do we become someone else? And he thinks we do that in the darkness of the forest. That we go to the forest, we have a picture of who we could be, and with that projection in the darkness, we become that new person. And, you know, he quotes Nietzsche, you know, after the drama, we have the new vision, and you know, all these kind of things. But one of the things I wanted to get your feedback on as a lawyer is this idea that this epiphany that this guy has, that God comes to him, rather like Satoshi Nakamoto, he understands the underlying nature of reality, that once you've learned, you can't unlearn, right? So once you've had this realization, oh look, I've seen the way the world works, that you could have this single history, that you can have a system where everyone knows what's going to happen, even when they're not there to check on it. And it's called the blockchain. And it's almost like what happens next is that, of course, he gets into a fight with the incumbent king, Pentheus, and Pentheus tries to lock him up, but he can't. He just slips out of his chains, and he says, "This isn't going to work." And then he, lightning bolt, and it sets the palace on fire. And the king doesn't get it. The king fundamentally doesn't get it because he's irrelevant now, and he won't go peacefully. He refuses to go peacefully, and as a result, the women, they rip him apart.
Yeah, it sounds fun.
Dionysus is overseeing the change of the laws. The laws are now changing because the human laws, the ones that are breakable, no longer map to the ones that aren't breakable, the physical laws. And it's only through that understanding, through wisdom, through the education of the Dionysian, that we get that. Is that something that we're going through right now, do you think?
No.
Okay.
I mean, no. I mean, I had a long conversation with Adam B. Levine and Stephanie Murphy at this point over the summer. And ultimately, the laws still continue to apply. They can't be broken, and they're there for a reason. They reflect a social understanding. Where Bitcoin and distributed technology are pushing us, we don't know. I think to the extent that it is pushing us in a more libertarian direction, I consider myself a libertarian, that change is going to be very incremental, and it's going to be based on the change of assumptions. Just like in the United States, like something like half a dozen or a dozen states have now legalized marijuana, and gay marriage is now legal in the majority of the states. That is a result of changing social attitudes on the bottom. And if you want to change things through technology, there are two approaches you can take. The first approach you can take is you can, pick up your sword and shield and charge headlong into the crowd, and which is effectively suicide. Wanton law breaking will lead to ruin for anyone. And it shouldn't be done. So, because there are reasons these things are enforced. In the case of the crowd sale paradigm, I think those things are enforced because of consumer protection. That doesn't say that a crowd sale could not be done over a blockchain while disintermediating all manner of financial intermediaries at a very low cost and very effectively. That, I think, is certainly possible, and I think that's what technology, frankly, like Eris will allow. However, we have seen a lot of projects do crowd sales, and we haven't seen a lot of deployments. So that raises the question: should they have been done in the first place? And it also raises the question of: are those laws valid in the first place? I think the answer is yes. So we can get there. There are two approaches: charge into it, or incremental, piece by piece, bit by bit, and changing assumptions on the ground about the way the world should work. And the blockchain and the distributed internet as a whole is very empowering for individuals. It allows you to interact with other people largely without interference. Bitcoin's big innovation: you can send value without interference. Now, what's happened is you have points of articulation where that money moves out in and out of the system. As you talk to any Bitcoin startup in London and say, how easy was it for you to get a bank account? And all of them are like, well, we can't. So what's happened is you have these gates shutting in front of that particular avenue. And the question is, well, what do? Do you keep hammering away at the gate? Or do you say, all right, well, we can actually provide really low-cost financial services to people in the developing world, and we can get bank expenses down so that fees fall, so that those savings are passed on to us. I mean, what will happen with blockchain, to be honest with you, one bank is going to deploy one of these databases, and they're going to automate a very large, not any particular bank, this is a hypothetical bank, but one bank will turn around and automate 70% of their back office. When that happens, every other bank in the city will do the same. The consequence is that these institutions, the people who work there, and the functionaries who administer it, and the buildings, and the servers, and the overheads, and the cost will disappear or be substantially reduced. Who will see the benefit of that? Ultimately, I suspect it will be the consumer. At the moment, banks are all operating very marginal businesses. They make huge profits, whatever. But on what, on $3 trillion of assets, you're considering a $15 billion profit is not a lot. So,
but they make salaries as well. I mean,
and they make salaries,
That's actually the main way that they make that money, is with lock-in. They lock in the net present value of that salary and that bonuses, and they expose the risk to everyone else, don't they?
And that really annoys people. And the question is, if you could have a bank which thought more strategically about what it was doing and then automated these processes, what would the net outcome be? I suspect the net outcome would be that you would have lower cost financial services that were easier to administer without having this sort of social class of financial services professionals who are very much disliked, not by me personally, but people say, well, hold on a second, we bailed you out and you had these big bonuses. So that would then disappear as the banks became much, much leaner, and you did not require so many functionaries to administer it. Who benefits from that? Everybody.
See, to me, the Pentheus in our story isn't the government, though. It's not the laws as capital L. It's actually the financiers, because they're the de facto in charge, aren't they? They define for us the rules by which we should behave.
No, I disagree. The laws dictate how they behave, and the fact is, blockchain technology is, my Casey continues to remind me. He says, don't always talk about the banks. I know it's what you know, but any other type of data-driven human interaction can be governed by this stuff. One example we thought of very early on, we said, well, we're a startup, right? So we've got to get a GitHub account and servers and this or that or this or that. And it's a distributed company. We've got one guy in London, one guy in The Hague, one in Sweden, and 2 in Canada. We said, well, this is crazy. We have these 10 different services, which we're paying for, so that we can send our data to them, they can hold on to it, we're now exposed to them. When instead, what if we could just set up a peer network with the 5 of us, and then just have all of that functionality scripted in, and then just each have a spare hard drive to hold it on. How much less expensive would that be? And the answer is actually quite substantially. So we're not looking at something where just the banks are going to be able to leverage this type of a distributed consensus. This goes all the way down the chain, down to a small business, down to a family that wants to, down to charitable organizations, down to financial inclusion initiatives in developing countries. That again, if you want to get rapid, reliable internet access on a financial platform, what do? Server, building, employees. Right. As you scale, the cost goes up. This allows you to scale, in theory, and I suspect in fact, without that cost rising by a very substantial amount. You have a very secure, very low cost way of getting data securely to somewhere and from somewhere on a blockchain. And to us, that's what makes sense about this. So then that reframes the question, and you say, well, what about the bankers? And you go, well, if we assume that the blockchain is actually going to be quite a democratizing tool that's going to give a lot of people the power to manage their own lives and manage their own data, do we then expect everybody else to behave? And I think the answer is yes. We will still, everyone should obey the law. I think people should pay their taxes. I have a problem with the level of taxes, but I don't argue about the liability to pay them, because that's a social norm. It's what you're supposed to do, so you do it. And if you want to change it, you do it through legal means. You do not attempt to circumvent.
So I suppose where you're coming from is that to some extent you're not going to deny that the blockchain does help us relate to the underlying nature of reality, because it's a database structure that fundamentally is different from the old style DBO structures we'd have with SQL databases, where you could just go and wipe some numbers out if you weren't happy with what happened. The problem with that is because it doesn't map with the universe's state, then all you're going to do is create further problems further down the line. You're just going to kick the can down the road. If you lie about things being the law of conservation in physics, if you burn up a whole bunch of energy and then you lie about the stuff and you push all the risk onto other people and you dump the chemicals down the stream, all it's going to do is cause further problems down the line, because your database no longer refers to the underlying nature of reality.
Disagree. I mean, that's a systemic question. I mean, this is a database technology. It is not a liberation tool. It is not a printing press. It is not. It is a database, and it is a database technology which is very adaptable. There may very well be social consequences, for good or ill, which arise as a result of the proliferation of this kind of database. We cannot predict what those are in advance. My suspicion is that it will pose a very serious challenge to tech giants in Silicon Valley, whose services are no longer required in order to administer data-driven human relationships. End of. So this is really designed to take all that and just, much in the same way that having distributed windmills and distributed solar panels reduces your reliance on consolidated Edison, and creates a much more resilient system. I think we should expect that the same thing would happen here, in the sense that you wouldn't, Gmail throws an error, and it throws an error for, 500,000, 1 million people. Here you just go fall back on the other nodes in your network. So it's a different way of looking at data and people and how they interact with each other. But that doesn't, I don't think you can plausibly draw any concrete conclusions as to what will happen socially as a result of that. It is designed to address an immediate need for data security, and an immediate need for privacy, and an immediate need for commercial efficiency. Those are the three needs that Thelonious and the D server address. Beyond that, we have very deliberately not incorporated any politics into what we're doing, because it clouds your vision.
Right.
So people who speak in Bitcoin in messianic terms are unlikely to view it as a centralized system. They're unlikely to criticize or find fault with the mining algorithm and the way that the database is currently administered. I think those are real problems. Tim Swanson thinks they're real problems. I think you do as well, and many others. So we have very deliberately, we all have our politics. You check it at the door. You build something, you build some tools, you build them useful. You leave your politics at the front door, and then you see what people are going to do with it, and you hope that you made the right decision.
Well, great. I think that's fantastic. So we have one question from Jamie Nelson. The government and banks are so intertwined now that it's very hard to distinguish between them. The laws are made specifically for the benefit of the banks, and was the whole point of the Bank of England to the Federal Reserve. Well, this is partly because, remember that particularly the derivatives market, it got so complicated at one point that the regulators themselves didn't even understand what they were up to.
And they've led, do
you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I mean, so those are really, I can understand where you're coming from with that. government and business have long been intertwined. But the fact is, the way that things are going now, in the last 10 years since the financial crisis, 10 years or 6 or 7 years since the financial crisis, there have been substantial reforms to the banking system. One of those is that you now have central clearing, which is required for any derivatives exposures over a certain amount. So you have more visibility as to where those exposures are building up. Another one is that banks are required to retain a proportion of the assets that they issue. We used to call it Rule 122A. I can't remember what it's called anymore. And they've got the same thing, Dodd-Frank, in the United States. So banks don't issue garbage assets because they have a big chunk of the first loss piece, which means that if the assets and the notes are junk, then the bank is going to suffer as well. These are systemic political questions. We don't ask what the political opinion is of an Apache database. End of story. I think that when we try to place these political interpretations on a blockchain database, we run the risk of not looking at it for what it could be, but we look at it for a lot of preconceptions based around the cryptocurrency community and the particular view that the community, of which I'm a part, takes of Bitcoin and related technologies. So again, I mean, I sympathize. I suspect Ben Lawsky will end up taking a bank position soon. I thought those guys ran for Congress, all the prosecutors in New York, Rudy Giuliani style. But you never know. Yes, that's a problem. It's always been a problem. It's always been, the founding fathers of the United States didn't like the idea of central banks. They said, was it Alexander Hamilton, more dangerous than standing? No, it wasn't Alexander Hamilton.
Jefferson said that. Hamilton was pro-bank.
Jefferson, yeah. Yeah, right. Alexander Hamilton wanted to have a central bank. Thomas Jefferson didn't.
Yeah. Been in England too long.
And we have a question from John. Your background is clearly in law, right?
Yeah, my background is in law. I worked in London as a trainee solicitor at one law firm, and then moved to another. I did securitization and structured finance. So this is an area I understand quite comprehensively because I did many long hours and many nights doing this, wading through piles of documents. So I'm a structured finance lawyer. I've done a bit of tax, a bit of competition, a bit of corporate, but mostly finance.
That's great. Well, thanks very much for being with us today.
No problem. It's a pleasure.
Let's just see if we can get your website up here. And also, you mentioned that you have a YouTube channel as well?
Yes. If you Google Eris Industries YouTube, it should just...
Okay.
Eris.
I think. Oh, that's our one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, at least we're Googling well. That's a good thing.
So if you go to, if you click on that bad boy, and then just go to the channel.
Okay, great.
Yep. So, and there's Doug the Marmot. He's our mascot.
Hey,
so you'll find him on all of our
What did you say of your official name, the description of your company was? It was a marmot.
Oh, yeah. So a friend of mine on the Marmot thing, he's like, basically, you're doing some really Mission Impossible type stuff.
Yeah.
It's Mission Impossible with woodland creatures. And so that one line has inspired a range of forested backgrounds with a marmot in front of it.
Well, that's great. I really love the marmot. The marmot means